This is CALLERLAB 2010, Niagara Falls, New York, and it's Tuesday, March the 30th. This is the session on Introduction to Challenge, or Introduction to Challenge Calling, or I can't remember just how they title it, but the basic notion is that we're going to be talking to people who are either thinking about getting into challenge calling or are just starting to get into challenge calling, or have started and are totally bewildered about what to do now. So hopefully the people in the room are in one of those categories. My name is Barry Clasper. I'm the moderator. Moderator is supposed to sort of keep things in line. Unfortunately, my panelist is Ed Foote, who doesn't believe in lines. This is the second panel Ed and I have done together. Yeah. This is the second panel Ed and I have done together, and people are starting to talk. You all know Ed. He was chairman of the Challenge Committee for 30 years, and so he's eminently qualified to speak on this subject. So let's start with Ed. Do you want that? Or
okay. Well, let me get an idea first of the mix of the room. How many of you have challenge group that you call for on a regular basis? Okay. How many have never called challenge, or just in here to see what it's all about?
I've called one too.
Okay. And 3 hands for there. Okay. How many of you have ever called a challenge dance? Not your own home club, but you've called a dance. Okay. So the mix here is really pretty new for everyone. I thought I'd start off and say, excuse me, that the difference, in my opinion, the difference between advanced and challenge is not nearly as great as the difference between plus and advanced. To me, it's a big, major deal for people to go from plus to advanced. Because first, they not only have to learn the calls, obviously, on the list, but they have to understand and accept the idea there is such a thing as DBD. In Mainstream Plus, you don't have to do that. And then in addition, they have to go back and relearn all the Mainstream Plus calls they thought they knew. So it's a big deal to go to advanced. But once you're an advanced dancer, and you're a pretty competent advanced dancer, to me it's nothing to go to C1. Because all you have to do is learn the calls. And most of the calls on the C1 list are pretty easy. So to me there's a lot less trauma to go to C1 from advanced. So Barry mentioned in an email to me, he wondered, is there any mindset difference between challenge and advanced? And I guess in my mind, maybe a little, but not very much. I mean, advanced, we push them a little bit. In my mind, I don't look for a higher percentage of breakdowns at C1 versus advanced because they expect to break down more. No, I think my acceptable breakdown percentage or acceptable floor rate is about the same. I usually go 85%, 80 to 85%. Whereas at a Mainstream Plus dance, I'm going for 90 and 95. I guess the big thing, excuse my cold here. I guess the big thing for me when someone comes, well, I get all choked up having you on the panel with me. The big key for people coming in to C1 is that they know advanced well. They know advanced thoroughly. They can understand DVD and do the calls from all the different positions, and fine. But unfortunately, since advanced in the last 15 years at least, has become kind of the in thing, everybody and their brother now is calling advanced. A lot of people call advanced just for the status. Oh, I'm calling advanced. Or they call it for money. I can attract people with an advanced group, so I'm going to have an advanced group, and I'll call enough to get by, but I'm not worried about making them good advanced dancers. So there are a lot of people that graduate from advanced and even have dance advanced for several years. And they say, "Oh, I'm doing pretty good. I'll go to C1." They don't know advanced. They don't understand the advanced calls. And in addition, when they went to advanced, maybe their advanced caller never went back and showed them the mainstream and plus calls, DBD. And maybe they didn't have to know it because if all they ever did was dance to that particular caller, then who never used mainstream plus DBD, then there was no reason for them to have to know this. So now all of a sudden they show up at C1 with a caller that knows what they're doing, and all of a sudden this person is very deficient in the knowledge they should have. So to me, the first thing that a teacher of C1 needs to know is, are these people prepared? Do they have a good foundation in mainstream plus and advanced? And if they don't, you give it to them. How do we give it to them? Let's assume they're weak. If they're strong, you have no problem. You just start doing the C1 calls. If they're weak, you have to go back and reteach or re-show a lot of these advanced and plus calls from different positions. And a purist might say, well, I'm going to do this at the beginning. No use doing any C1 calls till we have all this foundation down. So I'm going to spend the first 5 weeks going back and reviewing plus and reviewing advanced. Then we'll go to C1. Can't do that. The psychological makeup of the people that are there are, we want to learn new names. We want to learn some C1. So you can't ignore the C1. So my rule of thumb for doing this at C1 is the same as my rule of thumb for doing it advanced. At advanced, I say for every advanced call you teach, go back and review a mainstream or plus call DBD. And by the time you're done with A1, you'll have completed most of the list. Well, if the people coming into C1 have never done that, either with mainstream or plus or advanced, the same thing applies. For every C1 call you teach, go back and review a mainstream or plus call or advanced call DBD. So that your evening, probably for the first 2 months, is probably every evening you're going to have a review call from advanced or plus or something like that. Because they have to have the foundation. If the old saying, if you can have a tall building built on all these calls, but if you don't have the foundation, the whole building will crumble. So to me, that's the key. And the first key in teaching C1 is to go back and review and make sure that people know mainstream plus DBD. And if they don't know it, you review those calls with them as you are teaching C1. If you test them out the first night and they're sailing along pretty good, then no problem. Then you're all set. All right, that's my opener. I'll turn it over to Barry. You have your news.
I'll just hold the microphone a little farther away. Ed has been speaking a little more from the perspective of dancers coming in, like what should dancers be able to do or being led to do as they move into challenge. I'm going to talk a little bit more from the perspective of a caller who is new to challenge and is thinking about how do I get into calling challenge and understanding what challenge is all about. I have some speaking notes that I wrote myself here. I don't have any handout in particular, but if you wanted to get a copy of these speaking notes, we'll put it up on our personal website when we get home. So you can go to www.clasper.ca/articles, and you'll find this there among other things. It's just called Intro to Challenge Notes. What's different between challenge dancing and advanced dancing? Ed is right that, in theory, there isn't as much difference between challenge dancing and advanced dancing as there is between advanced and plus. But The difference between theory and practice and theory is less than the difference between practice and theory and practice. Did you get that? The fact is that dancers arriving at C1, and this is becoming more and more the case rather than less the case, do not know the basics. And by basics, I mean they don't know how to circulate. They don't know how to cast off three-quarters. They don't know how to slide through. The very first thing I taught my last C1 group was slide through. Those of you who were at the dance last night may have noticed that I got brave and I called a slide through from an 8-chain with the boys on the outside and the girls on the inside. And even with a room full of callers, I still had to wait and say, in your two-face lines, couples circulate. And if that had been a dance floor that wasn't composed of callers who actually knew what a two-face line was, I'd have had a crashed floor in my hand probably by doing that. And here we're talking about a basic that's where's slide through. It's number like 37 or something like that. It's not very far along relative to what you're supposed to know by the time you come into challenge. So the fact is that if you're working with new dancers when you're starting to teach challenge, you will definitely have to go back and rework all these basics. The second thing I had to teach this group was how to do a follow your neighbor, because cross your neighbor is on the C1 list, and they can't do follow your neighbor, so they can't do cross your neighbor. And the part that they can't do, it's not the, quote, hard part of cross your neighbor. For those of you who haven't tried any C1 yet, cross your neighbor is just to follow your neighbor with the people that come into the center use the opposite hand. So instead of using an inside hand, they cross-extend to an outside hand and cast three with the opposite hand. For the people looking out, it is exactly the same call. The people looking out do nothing different. And yet, it's the people looking out that had all the trouble. The people looking in, they had this different thing to do. They could sort of wrap their minds around that. But the notion that, well, I got this different name and I'm going to do the same thing I did before, that doesn't seem right somehow. But it turned out that they couldn't follow your neighbor. They can't peel off. They can peel and trail, but they can't peel off. And there's calls that have that action in them. So you're going to have to think about going back and reviewing all that kind of stuff. So assuming that they were actually trained in that, what is different between C1 and advanced? Well, the obvious thing is there's more calls, there's more formations, there's more stuff that they're supposed to be familiar with. But at C1, and I think this is a departure from advanced, or at least a dramatic extension of advanced, we get far more into using concepts, into using fractionalizations and distortions of calls, which means that we really start to demand DBD. Now, at advanced, one of the things I poke at, our session yesterday was talking about sussing the floor. When I call an advanced dance, one of the things I poke at is, well, how much dance by definition can they really do? Not just for the advanced calls that they're supposed to know, but for all the calls below that. And you generally find the level of that is fairly low. If you call motivate from anything other than zero waves, forget it. It ain't going to happen. And if you call slide through with the boys on the outside of an 8-chain, it ain't going to happen. So you have to really train your dancers to do that kind of stuff. And if you're going to dance real C1, it is real DBD. There's no boys' roles or girls' roles unless that's written into the definition of the call. There's no right-handed only version unless that's written into the definition of the call. So we really demand a knowledge of DBD. We expect the dancers to know that. That's the theory. In practice, you're going to find that the dancers, some of it they do. The DBD capability of a C1 floor will be much higher than the DBD capability of a plus or an advanced floor. But it still isn't absolute. Another thing that we get into a lot more than we do at lower levels is what I think of as geometric or matrix thinking. How many people think of a square as being a matrix? Squared up set is what? It's a 4x4 matrix. Now, most mainstream plus dancers are not thinking that way at all, and most advanced dancers are not either. They don't think about the square as being sitting in a grid of some kind, and they don't think about what happens to that grid when certain calls are done. And we demand that challenge dancers be aware of that. We talk a lot more about shape changing. Do you know what I mean by shape changing? So if I have lines facing and I call pass through, bend the line, have I shape changed? That was a trick question. I have shape changed because we use the term shape changing, but it's a misleading term. Most people think of shape changing as stuff like if I have waves and I turn the waves into diamonds or an hourglass or something, I've obviously changed shape. But the fact is, if I have a rectangle that's running from side to side, sidewall to sidewall, and I rotate that so that it's a rectangle that's running from head wall to head wall, that is also a shape changer. So the fact that I have a call that takes me from lines to lines doesn't mean that it's not a shape changer. Is load the boat a shape changer? Starts in lines, ends in an 8 chain through from standard formations. It's not a shape changer because the people are standing on the same footprints. So what defines a shape changer is, could I take the footprints the people had at the beginning of the call, forgetting their facing directions, and at the end of the call, could I populate those same footprints with the resulting people? And if the answer is yes, if the footprints don't move, then it isn't a shape changer. It doesn't matter which way they're facing. So from facing lines, pass through is not a shape changer, even though people think, well, I had facing lines, now I got lines back to back. That's different. The fact that the formation is different doesn't mean that it was a shape changer. That's a different way of thinking than what most mainstream plus callers are certainly used to doing. And let's be frank, candid. Many callers, I might even go so far as to say most callers who are calling advanced these days, are not thinking in an advanced choreography terms, certainly not thinking in challenge choreography terms. They are thinking in mainstream and plus choreography terms. They're doing mainstream and plus choreography with some new calls. And those people are training the advanced dancers that you're going to get as C1 callers. So you're going to have to cope with that, and you're going to have to recognize that if you're going to turn them into real C1 dancers and you're going to become a real C1 caller, that you have to start incorporating this kind of changing your mindset to that kind of thinking. Another thing that's different, I think, is the level of accuracy that you have to achieve with your call delivery. Squared up set. Heads touch a quarter. Everybody got that in their head? Zoom. What does that mean? Just the way I said it, it's perfectly legal. What do you think should happen? Henry's touching on the issue. At Mainstream and Plus, there's this very commonplace notion that if I start talking to one subset of dancers, so I start by the heads, I activate the heads, I can blather on for 5 minutes without ever saying heads again, and every call should be executed by the heads until it's absolutely clear that only, I need everybody to do the call. That changes definitely that challenge. If I say heads touch a quarter, and I want only the heads to be doing something after that, you need to say centers or heads or those people, something to identify to the dancers that it is really those people. Now, I'll agree that there are callers that will argue with me on that. And at C1, you can get away with it a lot more likely than if you're calling C2 or C3. Definitely as you start progressing up the levels, the demand for call accuracy goes up and up and up because the opportunities for ambiguity go up and up and up. If you call heads touch a quarter on a plus floor and then called zoom, Right? I mean, they would have no idea what to do with that, right? I mean, it would just be a stupid thing to do. On a C2 floor, I would hope what you'd get is each box doing the zoom. Now, you wouldn't get that universally, but
Nice.
that's what I would hope.
Jump in a second.
Yeah.
On the other hand, recognize that the people you're calling to at C1, especially new C1 people, have this whole history of having done it the other way. That the first call, heads do this. If the next call is just given, then it's going to be the heads and so on. So I don't like to assume people know anything. That keeps me happy. You know, if I assume people know something and then it proves that they don't, I'm unhappy. I don't want to be unhappy. So I always take out insurance. In this example, I'd say heads touch a quarter, everybody zoom. Now there's no question.
Exactly. I mean, and that my point really was not that you should just call heads touch a quarter zoom. It's that you need to be very, very clear about what you mean. Don't assume by getting sucked into this active dancer stuff that if you address something to the heads and then you address another 5 calls, it could be done by everybody. You know, I mean, let's take a common one. Heads touch a quarter, boys run. I mean, you hear that at Mainstream Plus all the time. That's, you know, a common singing call opener. Well, if you just call it that way, on a challenge floor, you might get all the boys running. So
I wouldn't run.
You need to be...
If I was a side, I wouldn't run.
You wouldn't?
No.
I would, just to make a point.
Yeah. Can I say one other thing?
Yeah.
We're going back to the shape changer. And to me, if most of you said you haven't done any C1 or just very little, I could just feel your eyes glaze over when he's talking about shape changers. And you're saying to yourself, I just want to call a call. I just want to teach something. What the heck is a shape changer? To me, don't worry about shape changers till C2. Most of the challenge people don't. Yeah, the real hep ones at C1 will think about it, and it applies it occasionally. But to me, I would tell anybody new calling it, don't worry about shape changers until C2. Just know the definitions yourself and get all the dancers knowing the definitions. I don't know whether
And here's where we have a point of disagreement. The reason I made a point of that here at C1 is because at C1, one of the things that we do for the first time is we really start asking the dancers to understand what formation they have at the beginning of a call and what formation they have at the end of a call. And they need those 2 pieces of information in order to execute the call. Think about, there's a concept called concentric. And the idea is one of these ideas that started very simply.
Formation is different than shape changer.
No, just a second. Let me go here a bit. Just so everybody in the room is in the same place. The idea behind concentric is I have a group such as a tidal wave, and I'm going to ask the center 4 people in that group to do a call in the center, and I'm going to ask the outside people to do the same call around the centers. So the common example is concentric recycle from a tidal wave. So the outer pairs would do their recycle around the outside of the center 4, and the center 4 would just do it in the center. Sounds like a simple idea when you say it fast. And you'll notice that recycle is a shape changer. Now, the rule for concentric very quickly got very, very complicated because of the fact that if you do shape changers in this concentric thing, how do you put back the resulting formation? Here was the quintessential example at the time the argument was taking place where we devised all these rules. But concentric is I think it's a 3-page definition these days. 3 pages long to define this concept. And it says things like, if you start in a 1x8 and you do a call that takes you to a 2x4, so here's this matrix stuff I'm thinking about. How many dancers can tell you whether recycle takes you from a 1x8 to a 2x4? Well, the actual call recycle does. But when you do it concentrically, you're working in a bigger matrix. But my point is that in order for a dancer to evaluate all the rules of concentric, they have to know the starting formation, that they started in, the logical starting formation and the logical ending formation, before they can figure out what the concentric adjustment is for the entire square. So we've asked them to understand whether this call is a shape changer or not. So they need to be aware of the idea that calls can change the shape, and that the shape isn't necessarily related to whether you've changed a line to, changing a line to a column is not changing the shape, but rotating a column is changing the shape. So it's a very important idea, and Ed's right that as you start moving through the levels, it becomes more and more important, and we make that demand on dancers a lot more heavily. But it starts at C1, and I think that's a difference.
As you said, the word shape changer confuses people. It should be some other name.
It should be, but it ain't.
It ain't. So therefore, I don't want to mess up new C1 dancers' minds with that ambiguous term. Fine along the way, because they're going to have to know it, but I just, at initial C1, and what most of the people here are going to be doing, I just want them to get the calls. And a concentric recycle, this is how you end. You start east-west, you go north-south. I don't care if it's a shape changer or a 2x7 or whatever. It's just, I want to keep it simple.
You can see the point of disagreement here, right?
Now, on the other hand, recognize that he knows a lot more than I do. So he's talking up here, and I'm talking down for the common man here.
And actually, this goes to another point about challenge dancing, in that it is very similar to all the levels that precede it, in that there, for each level, including each level of challenge that you go to, there's sort of a gestalt is a word that we've heard a lot, or an idiom. The idea being that there are things that the dancers are used to hearing and seeing, and there are things that they're not. Now, at challenge dancing, one of the big differences is we ask them to, if they hear something they've never heard before, we ask them to do it anyway. Right, at Mainstream and Plus, the idea is if you've never seen this before in your life, we can't expect you to do it. We'll show you how to do it, we'll workshop it, and we'll, give you, multiple exposures to it. We won't expect you to just figure it out on the fly. And that is definitely a difference between, even at advanced dancing. I expect advanced dancers to understand the rules well enough that if I give them a call out of a formation they've never seen before, but where the call can clearly be executed, I expect them to figure that out on the fly. Maybe not to the music, but on the fly. That is a distinct change in mindset. And we demand that a lot more at challenge dancing. That's a big part, in my mind, of what challenge dancing is about. Taking a call rule and a formation and maybe applying a concept to it, and basically saying to the dancers, you've got to mash those three things together and figure out what to do with what I just said. And it may be something you've never seen before in your life. In fact, it's hopefully something you've never seen before in your life, because that's part of the enjoyment, is doing this thing and saying, hey, that was neat. Question in the back. We have a microphone to hand out. Ed's got it, yeah.
For the tape, I'm Stephen Cole. I live in Tempe, Arizona. I don't call C1. I have been asked to call C1, so I have been studying diligently my definitions. I don't have time to take a class to actually learn to dance it, though that is in my plan. However, now talking about the levels of precision as we start from basic through C1, I can see that they get much more in depth. Are there calls that I'm going to find, even at that might be advanced calls or plus calls or even mainstream calls or even, I guess, C1 calls, that when I call them, I may have a certain expectation as an advanced caller to have an end result that might surprise, that I might get a different result on the floor? Is there a time that a shape-changing event may happen if I call something, and I can't think of any examples right off the top of my head, but if I did a motivate from not a wave, maybe there's a two-phase line or something where I start a call and I think, this is what's going to happen, and something else will happen. Are there places that I should look for to avoid traps?
My answer is no. If you know the definitions, a caller should never be surprised. If you're surprised, you don't know the definition. So if you're surprised, it means you don't know the definition well enough.
I'm not sure that was the question that you were. I'm sorry, Stephen. I'm not sure that was the question he was asking. I think he was asking, are there times when he's going to be surprised at what a challenge floor gives him, as opposed to the same call to a plus or an advanced floor? And well, here's a simple example. Squared up set, heads pass through. Where are they? This is actually a point of contention between the advanced and challenge world and the mainstream and plus world. On a mainstream floor, the dancers would probably be way the hell out there. In fact, they'd probably be out there facing in because they couldn't stand facing out, so they'd turn around or something. But they'd be back in squared up set footprints. If you call that same call on a C1 floor, they will be standing in between the sides. And they will expect that they will be treated as centers after that. And so if you were to call heads pass through and then another call that involved a centers and ends definition, for instance, heads pass through, crossover circulate. Sort of an extended application of crossover circulate too. But on a challenge floor, I would expect that the heads would recognize I am the centers of a T-bone line, and I would expect the sides to recognize I'm now the ends of a T-bone column and execute the call from there. So that's probably a different result than what you would have expected thinking in mainstream and plus terms. To go to the point that I was starting to go to with my remarks about Gestalt and whatnot, this idea that there are things that the dancers are used to seeing and not used to seeing, and whenever you enter a new level, the fact is you don't know what they are because they don't necessarily flow from one level to another. The fact is that at any given level, there's stuff the dancers are used to doing and find normal and commonplace, and there's stuff that they find just a little bit odd, but they'll do it, and there's stuff that they find mind-boggling, and from looking at the definitions, you can't tell one from the other. I mean, sometimes you can look at a call definition and say, yeah, this is tough. This is really hard. And other times you can say, well, this is nothing. But there's a lot of things, for instance, normal waves. Girls peel off. Say the girls are on the end. Girls peel off. Would you expect a mainstream floor to do that? Could you expect a challenge floor to do that? You could expect them, but it wouldn't happen. I thought one day, I looked and I said, follow your neighbor. Puts the girls on the outside, and the girls peel off. Neat way into Siamese. Wouldn't you think? I found that no floor below 3A will do that the first time, cold. So the fact that I'm doing a peel-off sweat plus, so it's a plus call, I should expect the girls to do this, no problem. They can't. So what that means is that you need to find somebody that can help you. You need a mentor because it ain't written down. There's no resources you can go to, which goes back to your question. Is there a place you can go and look all this up? And the answer is no. The definitions do not address this stuff. In fact, the definitions as they are written are incomplete. They're fuzzy. They're not a good reference the way they are right now. For somebody who's trying to learn this stuff, you can't rely on them. And I say that as somebody who does a lot of work with definitions. One of the reasons we're spending so much time on the definitions between Clark and I right now is we're just trying to clean up formatting inconsistencies and whatnot. But we actually look at real definitions and we find there's all kinds of stupid things in there. Let me give you an example, not on our list. Spread. Anybody read the definition for spread lately on the plus list? As in follow your neighbor and spread. If you read that definition, it lists 3 cases. There's the case where you've got lines or waves, in which case the ends and the centers spread past one another, trade places. You've got the case where you've got one couple standing in front of another couple, or tandem people, in which case the people in front spread apart, So that's the case where you've got like a wheel and deal and spread from lines facing out. And then you've got the case where somebody has been addressed to spread. So you might say from a static square, heads touch a quarter and spread. And you expect the heads to spread apart out of the center and the sides to step in. It addresses those three cases, and that's it. And then we add another one at C1 where you might say from a column normal, or from facing lines, normal couples, everybody touch a quarter and the boys spread. And that's used to be our quick way into blocks. Think about the call, coordinate. Starts in a column, ends in two-face lines from normal column setup. What if you call coordinate and spread? What would you expect to happen? So you'd expect the spread to happen in the lines. Why wouldn't you have the leads in the two-face lines spread apart and the trailers step in between them? Got two rules that are mutually inconsistent, written right in the definitions. So all I'm saying there is the definitions are inadequate. They're an attempt to capture our folk art and write things down, but they're incomplete. They will always be incomplete. And even if they were completely accurate, they're a lagging, I was going to say indicator. They're not an indicator of anything, but they lag behind what's really going on. So you can always find usages that are becoming popular or common, or at least known at every level, that aren't necessarily written in the definitions the way they're being used. And that's because the definitions are always trying to catch up with what's going on. They're recording and documenting what we do. They are not prescribing what we do. And that's that's a thing for the definitions committee to go into.
Can I jump in one thing? Yeah. You gave the example you gave for his thing of the heads pass through on the T-bone line ending was perfect. Do you have another? You have
another call, not off the top of my head.
Another example where he's going to start C1 and something big is going to surprise him, like that would. So I'm now looking for number 2.
Yeah. I can't think of one just off the top of my head.
That's my point. You're not going to be surprised. That's the only surprise you're going to have. Don't worry about it.
Well, I guess you can make mention of this on the mic, but some of the matrix things kind of not really freak me out, but as I've read about them, I'm afraid that if I say a call one way...
We should probably get this on the mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, Stephen Cole. So I was looking at the matrix things that are somewhat defined and somewhat not. And I've talked to some C1 callers about them, actually callers that call much higher than C1. And they say, well, it's kind of vague. And I'm just afraid that if I may say something that would trigger a C1 dancer from looking into a matrix and working with phantoms. That's at C1. C2? C1. C1.
Yeah, there's a form of phantoms at C1.
That may force them to step into a phantom mode that I may not be ready for. And I don't know if there's some colloquialisms, some common usage that I may not be aware of that I should avoid.
Don't worry about it. I mean, as teaching C1 new, you don't worry about that. And granted, the definitions, yeah, there's some little hiccups in there. For new people teaching C1, the definitions are fine. Just run with them. Don't get all psyched out of, well, something someplace may be off, and maybe it is off if you're applying this at C3, but for new people teaching C1, just run with the definitions. They're perfect for you.
Another bone of contention here. It might help if I just kind of whip through quick the notes that I had here, because they were really addressed at callers that are trying to get into C1 or just thinking about starting it or whatever. And then we can, maybe get into more specific questions that you all may have. So I just went through what I think of as being the fundamental differences between challenge calling or challenge dancing and other levels. So there's more calls and formations. There's concepts, phantoms, and fractionalization, and distortion of actions, which demands true DBD from the dancers. So you have to be aware of when you're doing that. Thinking in matrices and thinking about geometry is, again, something that's much more heavily leaned on. And the accuracy of what you say. You need to say exactly what you mean and who's supposed to be doing it every time. Don't assume that the dancers are going to carry something from, just because I said as couples once doesn't mean that it's as couples for the rest of your life. I have to say it every time. Now, things that don't change, and this is something that bugs the hell out of me when I watch people start to call even advanced. The basics of good calling do not change. Body flow and handedness and working with the music and your timing and presentation. The fact that you're calling challenge does not mean that you're allowed to be boring and stand up there and talk in a monotone, because it's challenge dancers. They don't care whether I've got any life in my voice or not. None of that changes. And I don't know why, I've watched really good mainstream of plus callers that have tremendous presentation capabilities. They get onto they get a C1 tip at a convention or something, and it is just so down in the dumps. And I put that down, I guess, to their feeling uncertain about what they're doing, so they don't have the confidence to kind of get that energy up. But don't change any of that stuff. Call it like you mean it. So all of that stuff is the same. So all the basics of good choreography are the same. Body flow and hand usages and that sort of thing are all the same. Management of difficulty. And you have to know the calls. Now, Ed is saying the definitions are good enough, and they're a good starting place, I think. I don't think they're everything you need to know, but you certainly need to know at least that much. You also need to know, if you think about at caller school, they give you the call diagram thing, where you write down all the attributes of a call that are important to know. You still need to know all that. So if you call a tally-ho, you need to know what everybody in that call is doing through the whole call. You need to know what their final rotation actions are. You need to know what hand they finished with. You need to know all that stuff about every call you're going to use. And on the C1 list, you got about 100 more calls. That's a lot of studying. So that's the stuff that doesn't change. So my recommendations about how you go about sort of getting into this, assuming you had ideal conditions, which nobody ever does. Ideal conditions would be you have, an experienced challenge caller who agrees to take you on as a protege. You have ideal documentation in the definitions that explain everything you need to know. You got lots of books and things that you can refer to. Probably you don't have any of that. Probably you've got maybe some dancers have approached you and said, could you teach us C1? And you say, well, I don't know C1 myself. We'll learn together. That's a very, very common scenario. So I recognize that these steps may be either impossible or you might have to take them out of order. But first step is prepare. It sounds so obvious, but the fact is a lot of people don't. How do you prepare? First, again, ideally, learn to dance the level. You see, a lot of people trying to learn to call C1 that can't dance C1. So learn to dance the level first. If you're in this situation where you don't have another live caller you can go learn C1 from so you can dance it, then you're going to have to start listening to tapes. There's lots of tapes around of C1 dances. There are lots of C1 lesson tapes available. Ed's got a series out is it still up to date, your series?
About 95%.
95%, and I know Mike Jacobs has a series out, and there's probably other people. You can go to magazines like Zip Coder, which is the magazine for advanced and challenge dancing, if you're not familiar with that. And they have references to those sorts of materials. You can go to the palomino-dosado.com website. They've got pointers to that kind of stuff. Vic Cedar's site has pointers to that kind of stuff. So you need to somehow start exposing yourself. I'm assuming C1 at this point. Exposing yourself to C1 dances and choreography. And more importantly, exposing yourself to what the current practitioners are doing. and I mean the current practitioners. Don't go find yourself a tape from 1985 and assume that it's the same now. There's different calls, there's different call usages, and if you put a 1985 challenge dance on and just played it at today's dancers, they'd probably have a lot of trouble with a lot of it. Not just the stuff that ain't on the list anymore, but there's just, as I said, there's this idiom at all the levels. Things they're used to, things they're not used to, and those things change all the time. So get current stuff. Study written sequences that other callers have written. Figure out why they put the calls together the way they did. And it also gives you that appreciation for which calls fit together and which ones don't. Push the checkers through those sequences so you can see what's really going on. You know, did they use that call to manipulate the square into a box 1-4 so that they had an element left, or they positioned themselves for some, whiz-bang get-out? Just like the calls at Mainstream and Plus, these calls all have choreographic effects. And you need to know what those choreographic effects are. And if you know that, then that helps you when you're sight calling, because you will get to the point where you sight call this stuff, because you know what's going to happen if you call a tally-ho, and you can start doing tally-hos into right and left grands and things like that. But you only know that if you've studied the calls, push the checkers through the calls. And when I say push the checkers, I mean push the checkers. Close your laptop. Don't use SD. Don't use CSDS. Push the checkers so that you get an idea how that call actually works. And I know it's hard, but you need to find somebody to mentor you. Now, you don't all have somebody in your area, and this brings me to a little project that I was hoping to get started on the Challenge Committee, which was something that would provide a remote mentor for people that don't have the luck of having an experienced challenge caller available to them locally to work with. And the idea would be to have a mechanism that puts you in touch with somebody via email or phone who you could go to with your questions like, I wrote this sequence, what's going to happen? So that you can start hearing from somebody that's used to working in these areas what is the common knowledge that isn't ever written down. English law has a concept of common law, which is the stuff that they're the rules, but they're not written down. And there's lots of that in square dancing. And the only way to find that out is by dancing to other callers, going to dances yourself, listening to tapes, and having somebody around that can explain things to you. How many people would find it useful if, for instance, I'm just sort of spitballing this out right now, but let's suppose that we had on the CALLERLAB website a list of people who had volunteered to be a challenge caller mentor for people who were just starting to get interested in calling challenge. How many would be interested in having somebody that they could pick off that list that they could then create sort of an email relationship with, who is somebody that you could maybe send some material and they would review it and critique it for you, or where you have a question like, what am I got when I do a heads pass through from a static square? Somebody who could answer those kinds of questions for you. Would that be useful, you think? So that's something we should, at least the new callers think it's a good idea.
It's interesting, at CALLERLAB for 20 years, we've been saying, if you have any questions on challenge, just call any challenge caller. They'll be flattered that you thought of them to call. Just call any challenge caller and ask them your question. There's no problem there. Nobody gets any calls. So maybe this list will make it easier for them to feel acceptable to do it.
You're right that it's not just any random challenge caller. Most people are reluctant to approach somebody that they don't know at all and say, hey, can you help me? I get calls, and I'm sure you get calls, but they tend to be from people who have at least met you, and feel that they've established some sort of a personal relationship. So this would just be a way for people that aren't in a position where they can they can't come to this convention and meet other guys that call challenge, or they don't have people in their area that they run across. So it would just be a way to reach out across that distance and create that one-to-one relationship. I'm not talking about just sending the guy a question. You get that all the time. And in fact, I get people, even dancers, I'm sure you had this when you were chairman as well. There's sort of a trickle of questions come in every year that somebody just writes at to info@CALLERLAB, what about this? Or was this right? I just answered one before I came here. Some character had called Zoom from a trade by position and expected the centers to pass through. And it was a dancer that sent this question saying, could this possibly be right? And so obviously they'd had a little argument with their caller, who clearly doesn't understand what Zoom is about. But we get those kinds of questions coming in. I'm talking about a bigger relationship than that. So it would be a continuing relationship where the mentor would take some sort of personal interest in the person they're mentoring, even though it is a distance relationship over email. Last couple of things. Once you've prepared, so you've gotten a bunch of dance tapes and you've listened to them, or you've learned to dance from a live caller and you've established this relationship, and you're going to start really getting into, trying to develop yourself as a challenge caller. Then you can start writing material. Once you know enough that you could actually, have some ideas to write material. If you're a mainstream of plus caller, you can get away with site calling everything or modules. But if you're really going to be a challenge caller, you have to write material. At C1, if you're a good site caller, you can probably get away with site calling a lot of stuff. Modules are good. Everybody uses modules, whether they like to think they do or not. But modules get harder and harder to use as you move up the levels, because the breadth of material that you have to cover gets wider and wider. And so the number of modules you've got to have in your head really gets huge, if you go that route. So you wind up, I think, having to write material. At least normal mortals do. The other thing is that, particularly at the higher challenge levels, there is an actual attitude amongst the dancers that if they don't see you reading stuff, you're not really giving them a good dance. Can't be good if you're just sight calling it all. There's a story about Ross Howell, which I'm not even sure it's true, but it's still a good story. One of the best sight callers in the business. And he was calling away at a festival, and he was obviously sight calling everything, didn't have anything in front of him, and he's calling C2 or something like that. And one of the dancers came up to him and complained, you're just sight calling everything. This can't be good, sort of attitude. So he hauls out a deck of blank 3x5 cards, puts it down in front of him, continues to sight call, but after each sequence he turns a card over. and everybody's happy. So the fact is, if you're a good sight caller that knows what you're doing and understands challenge choreography, you can sight call a lot of stuff. And I sight call a lot of stuff. I can sight call entire dances. And in fact, if I've got a weak floor, I might sight call an entire weekend. But that is not the ideal way to do it, and I do that after having done an awful lot of writing. So when I say write material, I mean write material and push the checkers through it. And then, if you've written material, you have to learn to read material. People think that's a trivial skill. It's not. Learning to read effectively, I won't say it's as hard as learning to sight call, but it is a difficult thing to learn. And learning to read material when you're in a convention sort of like this, where there's a lot of mainstream and plus around, they set the halls up assuming you're calling mainstream and plus. Most mainstream and plus callers like to have the table at the side, and they're standing, forward on the stage. They don't like the idea of having something in front of them. They say it blocks your connection to the dancers. Well, I'm 6'1", so I've never had that as a problem, but I can understand that, some callers feel that barrier there is something that's emotionally inhibiting. But most challenge callers, because you're reading, you like to have the table in front of you, so you've got a place to put your stuff. So you need to get used to being able to read in adverse conditions. You need to be able to read with the stuff off to the side, far away on a table. So it is a non-trivial skill. Practice it. And even after you get good at it, I find that if I have been sight calling for a while, that when I go back to reading, I'm jerky, like you kind of lose it. And if I'm reading for a while, when I go back to sight calling, I'm jerky. So learn to flip back and forth so that you can do both of them. Okay, I've blathered long enough. Do you have anything more that you want to add? Oh, yes.
Well, you brought up some good points here.
Gee, you wrote a whole page.
I just took notes on what you said.
Yeah, I didn't know I was that smart.
I totally agree with Barry. You must know the definitions backward and forward. If you like diagrams, there are two places where you can get diagrams in C1 calls. Vic Cedar's book and my book. Vic Cedar, you order it from him. My book, you order it from Palomino. It's all the C1 calls diagram from a number of different positions and with the definitions and that kind of thing. In another part of the country, there was a real established plus caller, one of the top callers in the area. Got bookings all over the place, a lot of clubs around. Smart. So he called some advanced. Fine. People came to him and said, why don't you do C1? Fine. He's smart, intelligent. So he started a C1 class. I'm in the area. I went to his C1 class. Just sat there and watched. He tried to teach every variation of whatever call he was teaching all at once. The people went bonkers. They didn't know anything. I mean, he's using C2 and C3 concepts, uses for concentric that the people were never going to hear at C1. You would never hear what he was teaching these people. You would never hear it at C1 dance because it's too hard. But he said, I'm going to show the people everything. So when you're teaching C1, just start out and show them the simple examples of the call. You can follow up with extra bonus stuff later on if they can handle it. But don't go overboard trying to show every conceivable usage of the calls because the people just don't want
just
that.
to add something to that, in order to know what the, quote, standard expected usages are, you have to have been exposed to the material that other people are using. Because, I mean, you can read the definition and extrapolate all kinds of stuff that is never used, even though it would be perfectly valid. So it comes back to you need to know what's going on in that phase of the activity.
And I talked about writing material, and I agree that's good. As a newer C1 caller, I encourage you to get people's tapes and just use the material. I mean, Steve Cotman sells tapes labeled Easy C1, and he knows you buy the tapes from him, you can use it. My dances, I've told people for years, just take my tapes and steal any material you want, then no problem with me. That gives you an idea, as Barry was saying, of how the flow, how things put together. Then once you see how callers are putting material together, then you can write your own.
Yeah, and just to emphasize, as a way to understand what works, what is expected, what's the gestalt, that's a good thing to do, is see other callers' material. But don't just take other callers' material and use it. And I'm not saying that because it's immoral or anything. I mean, we research things all the time. But one of the differences between challenge dancers and mainstream or plus dancers is that they do appreciate choreography. And they notice the difference between this guy's choreography and that guy's choreography. They may not be able to articulate it in a lot of words, but they pick the people that they want to dance to in some significant measure on the basis of how they like their choreography. So your choreography needs to be yours. You reading somebody else's choreography is not the same as you reading your own choreography. And we've done experiments occasionally where we'll take a staff of callers, we'll sort of randomly distribute some cards and each person reads another guy's card. And I mean, it usually doesn't turn out all that well. And another thing is often the dancers can pick out whose card was whose, even though somebody else delivered it. So the dancers are tuned into this, and part of what you're selling as a challenge caller is your take on the choreography. So good idea the way to sort of learn your way into it, but don't rely on that as being the way to move forward.
Barry mentioned about A lot of things don't change a challenge. Body flow, smooth dancing, use of the music, timing, and so on. If, say, at a national convention, you wander into the C2 or C3 hall, you may see callers in there who are, the music is a necessary evil. It's like, the rules say I got to have music, so I'll put the music on, but I'm going to ignore it. I'm just going to read my stuff. And unfortunately, then people see this and they say, well, that's what challenge is, so I'll never go into it because I want to dance to the music. You got to have good music. If you have good music as a plus and advanced, then you will hold your dancers. If you just talk everything, then you're not going to hold your dancers.
There's a story just to tack onto that. At the last National Advanced in Challenge, which Ed used to run, the last one in Milwaukee, the way the halls were laid out, you had to walk past the C4 hall to get to the advanced hall. And one night, Debbie Cedar was standing outside the door of the C4 hall, and I presume Vic was calling inside. And things had gotten a little rambunctious in the hall. People were having a good time. And this couple walks out from the advanced hall and walking down the hall, walking past the door to the C4 hall, and they hear all this commotion and screaming and yelling and going on in the C4 hall, and they say, we didn't know that there was a mainstream dance here. They couldn't believe the C4 dancers were having all this fun. I mean, that whole myth is something, don't take that into the challenge dancing. Challenge dancers are there to have fun. And fine, they may derive some of their fun from solving puzzles and from doing geometry and things like that, but how many people do you see laughing when they're doing a crossword puzzle? It doesn't mean they're not having a good time. Like, they're doing that for a reason. So challenge dancers expect to have fun every bit as much as mainstream plus dancers do. Sorry.
And you always have the people say, well, nobody's smiling. Crossword puzzle. I come back with, how many round dancers smile when they're round dancing? Nobody. Does that mean the round dancers aren't having fun? No, they're having fun. Barry's right in, you have to know how to read material. But it's a simple thing to do. There's maybe 4 or 5 hints for how to read material, and then you got it, and it's nothing. And I don't necessarily think I want to give these here because this isn't a thing on how to read material.
Write big.
Depends on your eyesight. All right, I'll give them real quick. Write big. Elevate your material. You don't want the material. You don't want to be here and the material's down here. You're pumping your head all the time. This applies to anything, whether it's plus or advanced. Put a suitcase here or something. Elevate your material. If you're at the and that applies to if you're calling, as Barry said, at a festival where everything is on the side. So you're calling here, here's the floor out here. Put something here, put your notes here. There's no problem in looking at your notes on the side as long as you elevate it. You must have an elevated platform for your material. Also, whenever you're writing material, and again, this applies to advanced or C1 or whatever, you'll have a card. Maybe you got 15 calls in there, and you lose your place. Awful. How do you avoid losing your place? You put eye catchers. An eye catcher is a horizontal line about 1/3 of an inch long on the far left side of your card after about every 4 calls. No more than 5 calls. That catches your eye and has your mind then block these things, these groups of calls into blocks, and then as you're going along, you're not going to lose your place. That's a key thing that I found, and I learned that a long time ago because I was losing my place, and it works like a charm.
And one more thing, if you're working off real cards or paper, don't fall into the trap of feeling that you have to fill it up. When I started transcribing a lot of my cards into the computer, I realized that they were way too long. And they were way too long because I had an 8x5 index card here, and I was going to fill it up. And you wind up with sequences that are 30 calls long. That's way too long. That's another thing that doesn't change with, the approach to challenge dancing. sequences should have some variation in their length, but 30 is always way too long, and 5 is usually too short.
My rule of thumb is 12. 12 to 15. If I get to 15 calls, then I want my get-outs. If I'm writing big, I'll use the other side of the card, but my rule of thumb is 15 calls and I want to get out. My overall rule of thumb on length of sequences, whether it's plus or advanced, is 45 seconds. Maybe occasionally at C1 I'll go longer, but my rule is always I want to give people a lot of carrots of the right and left grand, get out or at home, resolve, so I don't want sequences to be real long. The comment that dancers expect people at Challenge to read, not for the people you're going to be calling to. You're all new people. They won't expect you to read. Just sight call it. And at a festival or convention, if you're assigned a C1 tip, you can just sight call it. The emphasis on reading really only starts at C2. At C3, people expect you to read. Better have the cards out there. C2, it's 50-50. If it's a real strong C2 group, they expect you to read. If it's a weak one, they don't mind if you sight call, because remember, when you read material, it's harder than when you sight call. Written material is harder than sight calling material just by virtue of it having been written. So dancers that kind of know they're weak want you to sight call, because then they feel you're right in with them and you're calling right to what they are doing, and you're not locked into this prepared material.
And basically agree with what Ed just said, even though I said learn to read. The reason I said that is because if the idea is you're going to develop into, quote, real challenge callers, you're going to need to read eventually. And also writing choreography helps you to learn to sight call choreography and get your way into it. Otherwise, you fall into the trap of thinking like a plus caller, and you're just using a few C1 calls in your plus calling. So you need to go through the exercise of writing material so that you go through the exercise of thinking through the choreographic principles and intricacies that you're going to try and present, and not just work with a few modules that you figured out and you repeat over and over again. That's how we get the dancers. That's how we got to the place of having C1 dancers that can't slide through, was because people did not explore the calls. And to explore the calls, I think you need to write, even if you deliver it extemporaneously. I mean, I often sight call stuff that I basically wrote sometime or other, and I remember how all this fit together, but I don't have a resolution or anything. I'm still sight calling. But you need to get that stuff in your head somehow.
In your lessons, I would say sight call your lessons, but constantly be writing material. I'm going to write 3 sequences, and I'm going to slip into my lessons tonight. Don't feel that we're saying, well, you got to write everything for your lesson. You're never going to call C1. It's going to seem too overwhelming to you. Just go ahead and sight call your lessons, but keep writing a little bit of material here and there. And as you go through, by the time you get to the end of a C1 class, you'll have a whole bunch of material prepared.
Yeah. What I used to do is I would, as Ed said, I would have a few prepared cards that kind of had the stuff on them that I was hoping to get them, through that evening. And then I would sight call all the workshop stuff, hoping to work up to the point where when I called the cards, they'd be able to do them.
Here's another thing on sight calling. It's nice to have developed your calling ability so you can resolve at home, because especially starting with C1, people like the resolve at home. So you need to know how to do that. But then it's also to have some nice walk-ins to a right and left grand that are surprises, not the simple things that we might do at plus or advanced. Well, to have them be surprised and use a tally-ho to a right and left grand, it's too much mental effort to try to memorize it. Write it down. I have what I call get-out sheets, right and left grand get-out sheets for C1, C2, and C3. And at the top, for C1, it'll say right and left grand C1, facing lines, like a couple pages. I have another one for zero box. I have another one for, and lines out of sequence, facing lines out of sequence, in sequence, and zero box. And so when I'm calling for a group and say my home group, which isn't real strong, so I can sight call a lot there. I just have these sheets laying here. And I'm cruising along, and I've called my 12 calls. Okay, it's time for a get-out. I want to give them a neat get-out. I just glance down here and read one. Rule of thumb, my get-out can't be longer than 5 calls, preferably only 4. 3 to 5 calls. I just glanced down and picked one. I said, "Ooh, wow, that's neat stuff." And he sight called that. No, I didn't. I just read it off the sheet. So if you make some of these little get-out things for yourself, it'll help you all over the place. Questions? Anybody have any questions?
Oh, Dorian has a question. I thought you were just leaving.
Not really a question, just a couple of comments. When you're looking at someone else's choreography, regardless of where you get it, whether you get it off of a tape or off of a website or somewhere, don't assume that you can just pick up a sequence and read it and have the dancers dance it. If you don't understand the choreography, don't call it, because there's all kinds of issues that get involved in that. The other question was, or not a question, but a comment with the mentors. If you have a question about choreography, it's something a little bit ambiguous or something, and you go and ask someone, and they say, "Oh yeah, it's fine." Don't assume that it's fine. Even if they've called it on the floor somewhere and you've danced it, don't assume that it's fine. A couple examples. Can you evoke, I think we talked about this a long time ago, can you evoke magic and tandem at the same time? I danced it. Floor did it. It was perfect. Some people say, "Yeah, sure, no problem." And lots of people say, "Not a chance. You can't do that."
Well, you can if it's asymmetric.
Well, okay. Can you do tally-ho from two-face lines? Some people say sure. Some people say, yeah, I don't think so. How about transfer the column from Siamese setup with the girls in tandem facing out and the boys as a couple facing in? Is it an extend or is it a circulate? There's all kinds of issues like that that even established challenge callers will disagree about. My rule of thumb is, if I can't get a consensus pretty quickly, it's ambiguous and I'm not going to use it. Doran McBroom, Maryland.
Yeah, well, that's why it helps to talk to an experienced challenge caller versus somebody that's kind of new to it. There'll be people call me up on a question, and I'm always willing to say I don't know the answer, but I have 2 or 3 people who are my gurus that I'll go right to, and they'll always give me the answer. So I'm never going to con anybody into thinking I know the answer.
But it's important. I mean, Doran brings up an important point. There are points of contention in square dance, things which are not sort of generally agreed to. And you need to know what they are so that you don't fall into the trap of assuming, well, this is the way it's done, when in fact there's maybe a third of the people out there who think that ain't right. Here's an example. This is a point of contention that's never been resolved. There's a concept called stretch, which basically says I'm going to do a 2 or 4 person call, and in the resulting formation, the people that wind up in the center line are nearest the center are going to move across to the other side of the formation along the long axis. And when you see somebody do that diagram, a simple example would be from 2-face lines. A Ferris wheel is actually a stretch wheel and deal. So that's sort of the notion. Well, the question becomes, if you picture a column, and the call is stretch, hinge, who stretches? Do you have the centers of each side slither? Or do you have the 4 people in the middle sort of pairwise slide over to the other side of the title? And the fact is, if you ask some people, you get one answer. If you ask other people, you get another answer. And so the result is, I never call that. And the reason isn't because I don't know I know what I think is supposed to happen, but you can't make hold the dancers responsible for knowing what you think this controversy should be.
Did you want an answer to those 2 specific examples of the 2-face line? Because that's considered acceptable.
Yeah, the 2-face line tally-ho is definitely kosher.
And the same with the transfer.
No, I don't agree with the transfer.
Well, it would be a box transfer.
No, you're thinking Siamese.
Oh, he said Siamese. Didn't he say Siamese? He said
you
Siamese.
got a Siamese setup. You know what we mean by Siamese? There's one couple in tandem and another, or there's a couple and a tandem pair. So if the tandem pair are looking out of the Siamese box, and the couple is looking at their back. You can call things like transfer and crossfire, expecting the couple to extend, form a two-phase line, and do the and call. But I think it's generally agreed at this point, I think there's a growing consensus anyway, that calling just plain old vanilla transfer the column is not, quote, proper.
To be technically correct, you have to say box transfer.
No, you're thinking Siamese. I'm talking transfer the column. The lead two do their part to transfer the column. What some people want is for the trailing couples to extend, form a two-phase line in the middle, cast off 3/4, and step to a wave. That's what they think transfer the column is from there. And that's considered bogus in most quarters, but there are people who think that. You know, I don't think that many authoritative people think that. You know, like anything else, there's people whose opinion weighs more than others. And so Dorn is absolutely right. The fact that you went to somebody who you think knows what they're doing and you get, you know, opinion A doesn't mean that you should necessarily take it completely at face value. You know, see if that seems to be a consensus or whether you're getting different answers from different people, because then you're getting into one of these areas where if there's contention amongst the callers, there's contention amongst the dancers, you don't want to throw it out there on the floor. And another thing about challenge dancers that's different from mainstream plus dancers is they will come up and argue with you, especially if they know you're new. So, you know, if they know you're a newbie and you've done something that they think is, you know, counter to proper usage, they will come up and inform you, sometimes in very irritated tones. So you don't want to put yourself in that position any more than necessary.
I don't think Doran is right, because in the past there have been well-known challenge callers who were known for fudging. And so everything was okay because it's a fudge. Who cares? You know, well, so you don't want to ask them.
I think we're actually through our time. We're supposed to be done at noon, right?
Is it noon or 12:15?
Well, I think lunch is at 12:15.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, well, then we're... Okay.
So it's now 5 after, so unless somebody has another question, we can stick around for a minute or two if you want to talk to us one-on-one. Thank you for coming today. We appreciate your attention. Thanks to my panelist, Mr. Ed Foote. And if you do have any questions as a result of this or just whatever, feel free to email me. I don't know if Ed will offer the same. Put him on the spot.
I prefer phone calls.
Yeah, Ed likes to talk on the phone.
It's faster than me sitting there typing all the stuff that I can say.